Hey everyone, this is Bathmetrics. Welcome to episode 23 of Mixing Loud with Clip to Zero. In this video, I'll be explaining some considerations about mastering, both in the context of the Clip to Zero approach and also just in general. I'm going to be paying special attention to the controversy surrounding true peak levels, the controversy about whether you should create separate masters for streaming platforms, and I'm also going to be talking about controlling harshness and how to easily check for any potential problems with lossy codecs, especially those used on the streaming platforms. Just a reminder before I start, this is part of a long ongoing playlist about the Mixing Loud with Clip to Zero strategy. We're up to episode 23 now. We're almost done. I've got this video and one more video after this. Really, I've pretty much covered everything you need to know up to this point, but some people will want to, if you're new to mastering and some of these things, you might find this video helpful as kind of a capstone. And then talking about giving sounds their own focus in the stereo and depth fields is kind of a nuanced topic, and that's why I'm going to talk about it very last, because it's a little tricky to talk about. So, getting right into the content of this video, just to entice you to stick with the whole thing, I'm going to be talking about a bunch of final mix checks that I think are important. I'll be talking about what I call pretty processing. Some people call mix candy, but it's basically last minute things you tend to throw on the 2 bus, the mix bus, just before mastering. We'll talk about whether it's worth it to do that, how to test whether it's worth to do that, so on and so forth. I'm going to talk a little bit about mastering limiters, which ones you might want to use. Is it even really important to care about which mastering limiter you use if you're doing Clip to Zero? That's an interesting subject. I'll explain the true peak and streaming platform myth, aka controversy. I'll talk about how to definitively show that these two things are myths and how to prove it to yourself when you're mastering. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about dithering considerations and bit depth considerations. Okay, so let's hop right to it. First thing we're going to do is show you some waveforms. These are the last 3 sections of the song I'm going to be playing for you and demoing some principles on. This first clip right here on the top row is hitting -7.5 LUFS. That's what I decided to go for in my loudness target for this particular song when all was said and done. And you can see what the waveform looks like. It's not a horrible compressed sausage brick. It actually has, a fair amount of microdynamics and macrodynamics in it. And then this one below it is using the VCA trick, which I talked about back in episode, where are you? Right, episode 8, I talk about the VCA trick. So if you haven't seen that episode yet, go check it out to understand what I'm talking about. But basically, it's using a special set of VCA knobs to pull the entire mix, every single track and every single bus, to pull the signal down at the same time out of the clipper cascade. And by doing this, you can, it's kind of like the drive knob on a mastering limiter. You can decide exactly how much you want to crush everything up into the clippers that are sitting there at the ceiling at 0 dBFS. Push up into the clipper, you get a smaller amount of crest factor or microdynamic range. Pull them down out of the clippers and you get a bunch of peaks back, right? So you can have your mix as dynamic as you want or as non-dynamic as you want, as loud as you want, just by twisting one knob. That's what the VCA trick's about, if you haven't seen that video yet. So, basically I pulled down the VCA knob a few more dB from the point where I ended up making my target 7.5 LUFS master. And just to show you the waveform and how it looks a little different if you pull everything down out of the clippers at the top of the every track and bus, you get slightly more peaks. So you can see some sections, like especially here in the crescendo drop, there's a little more definition and granularity along the top and bottom of the waveform, whereas in the super loud points here, you get a little more of what kind of sort of looks like a sausage from a super high distance, right? This is a little more, has a little more microdynamics in it, right? But not that much. And honestly, they don't sound that much different because, you know, this track was designed to be made pretty loud, competitively loud at -7.5 LUFS. And actually, this was created with the VCA trick pulled down by 1 dB from where I originally built the mix. So it was even louder. It was hitting around -6.3 LUFS, but I decided this particular song didn't need to be that crushed. So I gave it a tiny bit more breathing room by pulling the VCA knob back by 1 dB. Okay, so that's just showing you kind of what the signals are looking like as you're listening to everything. So this is the song I did for my 2 Dan Worrell videos. You've heard it before. Sounds like this one. Let's just play a verse here. I do my best to learn to listen. All right, that's the quiet part. And here's kind of what the louder drop-ish sections sound like. Right, and then there's kind of a crescendo drop here. That's the loudest part of the song. All right, so that's what we're working with. And I'm not going to, you know, play the whole thing in 10 or anything like that. Just letting you hear a few snippets while we talk about mastering considerations for this. So the first thing I want to talk about is when you're getting ready to do the mastering, it's a good idea to not rush. Like you've spent a whole lot of time working on your mix and you're really excited and your ears are probably burnt out and you've heard this song way too many times while you fine-tuned everything about your mix. And the tendency is to rush into mastering and say, okay, let's master it. Let's get it burnt. Let's get it out there. And my best advice to you is don't rush this. Give yourself several days to just forget about the song entirely. Come back when you're fresh with fresh ears early in the morning or, you know, whenever your best time to work is. And just take a listen to your mix and make sure your mix is really good before you finally decide to master this, because you'd be surprised when you get a little distance and a little perspective, let your brain and your ears cool down and come back and listen to it. You're just going to notice things, even when you thought you were done and you thought your mix was perfect, right? So I'm going to talk about several checks I always do over a couple days. Like I will take my time and wait and do this every morning and think about all of these checks right here. What I call the harshness check, the mono check, the wall check, the high check, the sides check, and then the club SUV car check. When I was sort of being mentored by my good friend and mentor, Il Gates, he called these the 3 extremes. This is kind of the super lows, this is the super highs, and then this is the sides. And those are the 3 extreme things we never tend to stop and isolate and listen to carefully. So let's talk about these one by one. The first thing is harshness. Harshness is pretty insidious. And it's easy to lose sight of this, especially if you don't give your ears a lot of time to cool down. I'm going to go through the project and turn off all the places where I controlled harshness, which was, I have a couple melodic sounds that were just a little bit harsh, and then the vocals were a little bit harsh. And those are the only places I had to fix any harshness. And it's going to be tempting. This is the first tip I want to give you. It's going to be really tempting to try to handle all the harshness in one go on your master track, or you know, up on your, if you use a pre-master like I do on your pre-master, you're going to want to put something like soothe here, or spectral shaper from Isotope, or Rezo from Mastering the Mix. There's a couple good tools out there that are all good for dealing with harshness. And you're going to want to put it on like, oh, I hear harshness. Let me put it on my master and just take out all the harshness. But again, like so many things, when you do it to the entire mix and you're trying to fix harshness that's coming from one sound, one track, like the vocals, well, you notch out a bunch of frequencies to remove the harshness in your vocals, but you're also affecting everything else that shares those frequencies with the vocals and is filling up that space when the vocals aren't happening. So it's generally not a good strategy to fix harshness in one lump on the master. Again, like so many other things, go back to the source track. You're mixing at home, you're mastering at home. You have this luxury. You know, a mastering engineer doesn't. You just gave them a 2-bus mix, and they have a single stereo mix that they're trying to slap Band-Aids on and fix. So they might not have a choice if they're trying to get rid of harshness, but you do. So here's the whole mix with all my 3 harshness corrections turned off, and let's listen to what this sounds like. Yeah, there's just a little bit of spiky in the high end of those, you know, 2 synthy sounds. And if I go to the vocals of the song,
I do my best to learn to listen, since you have so much to say.
You know, a little bit of Essing might jump out at you, sibilance, right? But there's some other resonances in there that are just nasty little rings that are happening too. So if we turn on all the resonance suppressors again, you'll hear how it sounds much cleaner.
I do my best to learn to listen.
Right? Let's turn off the vocals again, let you hear the vocals.
I do my best to learn to listen, since you have so much to say.
Now cleaning up the resonance.
I do my best to learn to listen, since you have so much to say.
Right? Just a lot smoother, a lot cleaner, less things hitting your ears. My favorite tool is Rezo. I'll probably do a separate video once this series is done where I talk about why I like Rezo and prefer it over Soothe, which I also have, or Isotope's Spectral Shaper, which I also have. I love Rezo. I think it's amazing. So I'll talk about this in another video and keep this video nice and short, but you can see all the little adjustment points that are in here. And then it was the same thing for, you know, the glitch top and kind of the crescendo wonky guitar that's happening here. This is the correction on the wanky guitar type sound, and this is the correction on the main sort of sweepy, white, noisy synth that washes and sweeps. So, for example, I'll leave this visual for you. You can see this little sweep, that white noise wash that sweeps up, and that was really harsh in some of these frequency ranges, and so I dialed that out. And again, if we turn these on and off, here's without the resonance correction. See, it's just a little bit bitey, just a little bit harsh on your ears. Now here's with the correction. All right, so definite improvement, and I think the only real caveat I'll put in here, if you can't wait for my video about doing this, the main thing to remember about all these resonance correctors, whether it's Soothe or Rezo or any other tool, it's real easy to go overboard with them. Because when you start isolating and listening and soloing to where the resonances are, you tend to want to get rid of every last bit. And if you overdo it, you're going to take the life out of the sound. You're going to cloud the sound. A little bit of resonance buildup is okay. I mean, that's part of what makes the timbral nature of the sound. So don't overdo it. Typically what I do is I'll like make a bunch of adjustments and then I'll go, okay, I'll copy it to another setting and then I'll take them all and kind of raise them back up a little bit, like halfway up. And I'll kind of A/B compare the, absolutely no resonance versus a little bit of resonance. And I almost always pick the version that has a little bit of resonance because it isn't killing the sound as much. I want it to be as transparent as possible while still effectively getting rid of most of the ringy buildup you might hear. But that's a subject for another video, and just keep that in mind if you're going to experiment with these tools in the meantime. Okay, so that's the resonance check, the harshness check. The mono check is pretty simple. There's a lot of ways to do it. Bitwig, we have a little studio thing that can let me just jump in and out of mono. And what I like to do is check a couple key sections. So here's the verse. What you want to have happen is when you collapse everything to mono, you don't want to hear any important sounds lose too much volume. That's all you're checking for, is that it sounds pretty much the same in mono or not. So for example, we're going to listen to the verse and click this button here on and off.
I do my best to learn to listen, since you have so much to...
Right? We don't lose anything. Let's check the solo section. Now here, this synth is a very wide synth. That's part of what makes it interesting. What you can't avoid losing all power when you collapse to mono, especially if you got any kind of wide sound. The trick is like, where's that balance point? Where's that compromise you're okay with? If you just listened to this in mono and hadn't heard the nice wide version, you wouldn't think anything was truly amiss with this version. Watch. See, so now that I've talked a little bit and reset your brain. Right? Everything that's important still has balance. It still feels balanced. Yeah, granted, it's not as wide and as full and lush sounding, but it sounded okay. And that's what you're looking for with your mono check, is just make sure you're not losing too much of some important sound. I mean, there's no question that sounds better in stereo, but not everyone listens to your music in stereo. So you just have to find that compromise. And the same for the crescendo section. We'll take a quick check. Right, and again, nothing really amiss there. So quick mono check. Now the wall check is a fun one. We'll go back to the verse for this. And now we're going to start taking advantage of some things that are on the listen bus. So I like to use a tool called Isolate for this. It's available from DP Pro Audio. It's not very expensive. It's just a really useful way to check certain frequency ranges. You can also do the same thing with adapter metric AB, but I'm just going to show you on this. So the wall check is basically everything below about 700 hertz. So I'm just going to solo these two bands. And what this, I call it the wall check because, and I think Underdog calls it the cloakroom check. Because when you're first entering a club or you're outside a club, approaching it from outside the building, you're hearing all the bass coming through the walls, right? And that's all you hear because everything else is being attenuated. So any given song that might be in progress sounds like this as you approach the club and listen to what's going on through the walls of the club itself. right? Or if we go up to the big crescendo section, so this is a good way, doing this check from about 700 hertz down with a fairly gentle filter. It just gives you a final feel for the true balance of your low end, and probably also your snare, which often has a little bit of a low end component in it for the thumpy body of the snare. You want to just feel like everything's in balance and nothing's poking out too much. You don't want the sub itself to feel overwhelming compared to the kick and the snare. And you don't want either the kick or the snare to poke out as especially loud in relation to the other things. I mean, this is a sound that's real easy to kind of like relate to. It just gives you a good feel for sort of the main dance pulse of the song that people are going to dance to, and whether or not every element that's important there, which is mostly the low end, is balanced, right? So that's a useful check, I think. I call that the wall check. Now, the high check is similar, but it's the extreme high frequencies above 8K. And you can kind of also extend that down to about 2,500 hertz. And up, and try both of those. But let's hear the 8K region. And what you're listening for here is a lot of grittiness and chunkiness and aliasing can hide up here. So it's a good idea to just double check it and make sure it sounds smooth and you're not hearing any weird gritty chunkiness up here. Right? You want it all to sound smooth. And then if we extend it down a little bit more, now you're hearing just the super high range. You don't want to hear anything too harsh or too gritty when you extend it down to 2,500. So that's the high check. It's definitely worth paying attention, because if you're hearing grittiness, that could mean too much clipping. It could mean other problems, and good luck figuring them out, right? You have to kind of think about the sounds that are really being pushed high with a lot of OTT style processing and things like that, and maybe check and see if you're overdoing it. Okay, and then the sides check is pretty simple. Again, you just need something that'll isolate the side frequencies. So in isolate, that's this button here. And again, you're listening for things that shouldn't be in the sides being pushed too much in the sides, right? Like you don't want too much of your low frequencies in the sides, although that's not necessarily terrible, but typically you don't want to hear the kick too much when you're listening to the sides. You don't want to hear the sub too much when you're listening to the sides, or that could mean your kick and your sub are lacking a little bit of definition, and they won't have as much power as possible in clubs that tend to break out the sub frequencies into a mono array instead of playing through stereo full stacks. Right? You typically don't want to hear low frequency content too much in the sides. If you're only hearing high frequency content and mid frequency content, then you're probably on the right track. So that's the wall check, high check, and sides check, mono check, and harshness we've talked about. The last thing is the club and SUV check. And that's pretty simple. We do that, well, I do that with Slate VSX. And I know this isn't going to be an option for some of you. You might balk a little bit at the price tag. It can be a little pricey, but it is worth it because it lets you do things like this. So You know, it's gonna sound a little different to you than it does to me because I'm listening on earphones that are made for this system. So, you know, I'm hearing it the way they intended it to be. But I just check on 2 key speakers, and I also check in a car simulation, an SUV simulation, and a club simulation. And this is probably the most important one for the music I make, since it's all got to sound okay in a club, right? What you're looking for is a quick jump through to make sure nothing's standing out as really wrong or imbalanced in any one of these. So this is on a pair of midfield barefoots. This one's on these big soffit-mounted Empires back here. I think those are Empires. Some random hybrid car, some SUV, and some club, right? This is a club in LA. I forget what it's called. All right, so quick check.
I do my best to learn to listen. Since you have so much to say, if I connect with your position, I will learn so much that way.
All right, you get the idea. If you have mix checking software, oh my gosh, it's so worth it. Not just for your production, but for your final mixes. You just want to make sure it sounds balanced and it's translating well across those very different platforms, and you're in good shape. Okay, so let's talk about pretty processing, or mix candy. And what I mean by this are things you tend to put on your master bus or your pre-master after the mix is all done. Something like, for example, Gullfoss, or some final EQ tweaks. I used to like Smart EQ 3. I still like it. So, you know, Gullfoss is this sort of magic resonance tamer. That's what this tame stuff is. And then it also finds signals that are a little bit buried and masked and pushes them up a little bit, and it does a lot of dynamic compression against a bunch of very small, tiny granular ranges. So let's let you hear Gullfoss on here, and we're just going to bypass it on and off. It's already set up correctly for this project. I'm not going to talk about how to use Gullfoss. I'm just showing you, do you need Gullfoss or not? Is it going to sound different or not? So here's the verse with and without it. Here's without and with, right?
I do my best to learn to listen. Since you have so much to say, if I connect with your position, I will.
So in this case, for this song, honestly, Gullfoss isn't really bringing anything that incredible to the table. Everything it's doing is incredibly subtle in this particular mix. Now, sometimes Gullfoss works magic on certain kinds of sounds and mixes, right? Other times it doesn't. You know, if you've mixed it right in the first place, Gullfoss isn't going to change it much because, honestly, not that much needs changing. So in this case, I would choose not to use Gullfoss, and I'll tell you why, because this is the main thing. If you're going to put any kind of final processing on your mix bus, whether it's Gullfoss or some sort of vintage tape saturation, or maybe you're really in love with one of the high-end saturation boxes like Black Box HG2, or there's a VSM thing out there. There's a few kind of well-liked simulations of famous saturators, hardware saturators. If you like those things to put on as a final little bit of candy gloss on top of your mix, here's one thing I want you to be aware of. And now we're going to start looking at the limiter for a second. So I've just got one single copy of Pro L2 on here. And right now it's not pushed at all. It's just at the bottom. It's basically going to limit at 0. Okay, now my clip to zero clipper cascade is already limiting everything to zero. So when I play this,
I do my best to learn to listen. Since you had
okay, see, there's no actual limiting happening. There's no gain reduction happening because clip to zero is already taking care of that by the time we get to my mix bus. But if I turn on any pretty processing like Gullfoss, this is going to create new peaks after my final clippers and limiters and my clipper cascade. Because I'm putting this on at the end, it's going to change the peaks of the signal. And Gullfoss in particular does both expansion or upward compression and upward expansion, right? And it also does downward compression. And it does both of those. And because of that, it's going to create new peaks.
do my best to learn to listen. Since you have so much to say.
Right, so you can see, the limiter is now limiting some things, but the places where it has to limit are very sporadic because I've got Gullfoss set up so it's not overdoing things. If we try the solo crescendo, let's see if we get more things getting limited. Right, there's a few little events that are getting limited now. Not too bad, and that's what you want. If you put on pretty processing of any sort, you don't want to suddenly see the limiter working like crazy to compensate for all the crazy stuff your pretty processing has done. So just bear in mind, this is why we use a final limiter, because if you do put on any kind of extra candy gloss pretty processing, you're going to need it because you're going to have some final peaks that need to be taken down. Okay, so let's talk about mastering limiters themselves. Which one's best? Well, the good news, although it may disappoint some of you, because you've seen me talk about limiters in the past, and limiters are often a very often discussed subject when it comes to loudness, on how to get loud mixes, which mastering limiter lets you get loud best, which is cleanest, so on and so forth, which algorithm's best. You know what? In the clip to zero method, they're all the same. It really doesn't matter. Whatever limiter you have is probably just fine. Now, why can I say that? It's because we're doing all the mastering, the limiting, the loudness, the maximization. We're doing all this with the clip to zero approach itself. We've effectively done our mastering throughout the entire process I've been describing in this series so far. Right from day one, from the very first sounds you put in your project, you're kind of working at a mastered level. And all of the clip to zero gain staging where we push the RMS up as close to the ceiling at zero as possible, right? And we use the VCA trick to pull the RMS and the whole signal down out of the clipper cascade or push it up harder into the clipper cascade. That's effectively what you're doing in any mastering limiter when you push this gain. You're just pushing the RMS of the signal up into the ceiling of the limiter, and it's chopping off peaks in the way that limiters do. So if you're not actually doing any final post-processing at the end of your mix, up on your pre-master or master, depending on where it stops, you can see there's no limiting happening because I'm stopping at my ceiling of the limiter. The limiter almost doesn't matter because you do your limiting really with the VCA knob and the VCA trick. Where you set this determines how hard you're pushing the signal into the clippers, all sitting up at zero. It's like you're pushing this up and down, right? So if you want your mix a little more dynamic, you just pull down the VCA group. If you want your mix less dynamic and louder, you push it up. And you do a couple comparison tests, like which one do I like better? Do I like it a little more dynamic with this pulled down a few dB? Or do I like it where I originally built the mix up around, with like at this target loudness level, which in the case of this song was around -6, -7. So you control your total result and your total crest factor, your microdynamics, your transients. You control all that with the clip to zero method itself and with the VCA group, right? You don't do it with the mastering limiter. This is only here as a final fence, a final ceiling, mostly just in case you decide to, use something like Golfos or a tape saturator, or do the tiniest little bit of final EQ adjustment, right? Anything that's going to affect where the peaks of the mix are sitting. That's why you have this here, to catch those final peaks. Even if you do pretty processing, it's usually not going to create peaks that are more than 2 or 3 dB at most above, this nice flat waveform we have right now. And usually any place you get additional peaks are going to be so spread out from each other that you just get a little blip here and another little blip here and maybe another little blip here. And it doesn't look like your typical track where you see someone put on a mastering limiter and crunch it up to 6 or 8 dB of gain reduction, and you just see this sea of constant red up here because the limiter is always working. You're not going to see that in the clip to zero method. So this is just a last little safety ceiling. And so because you're not working the limiter hard, they're all the same. They all sound the same, right? You hear the differences in all the various mastering limiters when you work them much harder than they really want to be worked. When you stress them, that's when you hear, oh, elevate is better for certain kinds of music and certain kinds of signals. Oh, smart limit might sound better for this genre or that genre that isn't too bass heavy. Oh, FabFilter Pro L is a standard, everyone uses it, but do you use the modern algorithm, or do you use the punchy algorithm, or do you use the transparent algorithm? What's your favorite algorithm, right? They all sound essentially the same as each other when you're doing next to no actual limiting with the limiter. When it's not working at all, it's just catching a few stray peaks here and there. So at the end of the day, if you're using clip to zero and you're getting it right in your mix, which is where you should be getting all your loudness and all your final control of macro dynamics and micro dynamics, right? Your total dynamic range. The limiter just doesn't matter, right? Use whichever one you have. I use Pro L a lot in these videos because it has this nice graph showing you what's happening. Other limiters aren't so good at showing you what they're actually doing. But there's nothing special. They're all going to sound the same. If I throw Limitless on this track, it'll sound exactly the same as if I use Pro L2. It'll sound exactly the same if I use Elevate or, TDR Limiter 6 or Smart Limit or any of them. I have all of them, and they all will sound the same on this song because they're not doing anything, or they're doing almost nothing, right? So put your mind at ease. If you have any mastering limiter, it's good enough. You don't need to go out and spend money on some new fancy limiter because Baffy said it's the best with CTZ. Don't even worry about it. Now, what is important when it comes to your limiters is whether or not they force you to use true peak limiting. And this is my main beef. I've got a beef with Sonable. I'm just going to pull up Smart Limit here and show you this real quick. So Smart Limit is a very promising limiter, but not right now. Maybe when they fix a few bugs and feature issues and user issues I've talked with them about, maybe this will become a very good limiter. The concept behind it is good, the metering is great, but there's a big problem with it right now, and that's that if you have any kind of limit ceiling that you set, it's always true peak limiting. It's always going to limit the true peaks, the intersample peaks, to whatever value you set here with the ceiling. And that's a big problem. Even when it's at 0 dB, it's still true peak limiting, okay? There's another problem with it in that the bass control, spectral limiters like this, Elevate is prone to this problem too. Elevate and Smart Limit are spectral limiters. And they tend to work their transparency magic and sound really good up in the mid-range and highs. They do that because they rob the lowest sub-frequencies of quite a bit of energy in order to pull off their tricks. And in Elevate, you can say, no, 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 do not cut my sub-range down by 3 dB. Like, I can hear that. It's like you just cut the low end off my mix entirely. There's no bottom end anymore, like especially for dance music, which relies heavily on the sub. At least in Elevate, you can bring it back using their EQ section. And this one theoretically has a bass control knob that's supposed to let you bring it back and say, don't rob so much of my sub region, but the corner frequency on this is off. Where this actually boosts your sub again is too high. It's up out of the sub range. It's kind of in the low, 80 hertz, 100 hertz, 120 hertz seems to be where its focus is. And so it'll rob your subs and you'll hear it and you can't get it back, right? So they need to fix that too. So for those reasons, right now, I do not recommend Smart Limit because it forces True Peak and it robs a little bit too much from your subs if you're making dance music. But to their credit, Sonable seems to know those are potential problems, and I imagine they'll address that someday, and that could be a really good limiter then. Until that time, I recommend you go with a limiter that lets you turn off the True Peak. It might be there by default, but if there's any kind of True Peak limiting button, my recommendation, turn it off. Don't even worry about True Peak. Don't even think about True Peak, because I fully believe True Peak is a myth. Now, I don't mean that in the QAnon crazy sauce kind of way. I'm being a little hyperbolic when I call it a myth, but let's talk about why I call it a myth. So I talk about True Peak in detail in my Clip to Zero handbook. This is linked in the description of this video. I have a section called The True Peak Hoax and another section called Don't Master for Streaming, which goes into much more detail about what I'm about to summarize for you. But the bottom line is, True Peak is one of those issues that theoretically is sound, but in practice, nobody actually observes because it's problematic to observe it. And when I say nobody observes it, I mean all the big labels, all the pro engineers, all the label releases, and all of the producers and mix engineers in the more indie genres that are knowledgeable. We all ignore it. Nobody cares about True Peak limiting, even though it's a selling point and you hear all the well-intentioned YouTube videos about mixing and mastering tell you to use True Peak and show you using True Peak. My advice is don't do it, because nobody actually does it, because it causes problems, and the problems True Peak solves one problem that's minor in practice, but it creates a whole bunch of huge problems that aren't minor in actual practice. And that's the problem with True Peak. So one little data point I want to give you is if you go to a site called Finalizer by TC Electronic, they've got this kind of online check your mix thing. And what's cool about it is they have a lot of reference tracks of different genres. Like, you can go into all these different genres and see a selection of tracks that they've analyzed. And, the idea is you can literally load your mix into this and compare your statistics against the statistics for famous reference tracks that are out there in various genres. Now, what I want to show you is for every one of these, they've got a basic set of loudness metrics and True Peak metrics. And they show you the overall amount that it's compressed, right? So you go to any kind of reference song, and you're going to see True Peak values that are positive, way over the supposed set your mastering limiter to -1 True Peak if you're going to upload to streaming platforms, because, oh my gosh, sky is falling, transcoding to MP3 or whatever codec they use. These True Peaks become a big problem, and you'll have horrible clipping and everything will be distorted, and oh my God, sky is falling. It's not true. Nobody does it. These are masters that have all been uploaded and have been out there forever, right? And it doesn't matter what genre we're in. Again, we can go to like dance genres and you can see, you know, again, true peak, 3 over true peak, right? 1.4 over true peak, negative 0.2 over true peak. I mean, you can go on, right? None of these almost are below true peak, a very few. And you can also find your favorite reference tracks and analyze them yourself in whatever tool and see what true peak values they have. And you're going to see nobody cares about true peak. This song, the way that it's done right now, if I go to my listen bus and we bring up DP meter 5, let's see what this loudest section measures in true peak. I'm going to just the loudest section of the song. All right, we're going to watch this value right here. So you saw it stayed around 0.2 over 0, and then at one spot it blipped up to 0.5. Remember, this is a max true peak value. We can see a more holistic version of this and real-time version of this by going to a tool called Streamliner by Adapter. And I'm going to talk about this in a second after I've talked about mastering to streaming platforms. So this is the other big myth that I talk about in my book. This whole notion that you should master to negative 14 LUFS because you're going to upload everything to, you know, DistroKid or whatever, and it's going to end up on the streaming platforms, most of which are somewhere around negative 12 LUFS, negative 13 LUFS, negative 14 LUFS, somewhere in there. And the argument is you should take advantage of all that dynamic range. Right? If your RMS is going to be squashed down or normalized down to negative 14 LUFS, why not take advantage of all that headroom and have some nice transient peaks and get a little more punch and microdynamics back in your mix? You'll sound louder than some sausage loud electronic dance mix that gets normalized down to negative 14. I mean, look how tiny and squished this waveform looks compared to this nice dynamic waveform with big spiky peaks on it, right? That's the theory. That's the story that there's a certain faction out there among engineers and YouTube educators, right? Dynamic range is best. It's louder. It'll be louder. It'll sound louder. No, it won't. Loudness is this perceptual thing that revolves around mostly mid-range density and also to some degree the balance, the kind of Fletcher-Munson balance of your sub and bass frequencies versus your high frequencies versus your mid frequencies, right? And it's this psychoacoustic thing. It doesn't have anything to do with the crest factor of your waveform. It doesn't have anything to do with the PLR or PSR, the peak to loudness ratio. That's another way of looking at crest factor in LUFS terms, right? It doesn't matter. If you make a loud track that is perceptually loud, that has density and hotness and sounds a little saturated, sounds a little clipped, right? Because you squished everything into a fairly small dynamic range and there's some hotness and aliasing and distortion of pleasant kinds that come with saturation and clipping, you're just going to sound louder. Regardless if you're normalized against a more dynamic track. The more dynamic track is going to sound a little darker, a little more cloudy, a little more thin in ways, and you will sound louder. So you do not create a negative 14 master to upload to DistroKid and then another negative 7 master to take to your gigs if you're a DJ. You don't do that. Nobody does that. You make one master to rule them all. Just make any given song as loud as it needs to be, as loud as sounds good. And that's that one master. It'll sound great when it's normalized down on Spotify or anything. It'll sound just as good as when you play it out in the club, right? You do not need to make separate masters. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy, in part because all of the current standards on the streaming platforms today will be different a year from now, will be different 2 years from now. They've already changed over time. And someday 5G is going to be broadly available to everyone, and there's no reason to have compressed files anymore. You know, you'll be able to stream lossless FLACs or whatever on your cell phone because of 5G, and you already can do this on your desktop computers, right, with things like Deezer and so on and so forth. So why cripple your master by tweaking it into shape for some crappy quote-unquote platform standard today and some stupid advice to like cut your mix down to -1 true peak so you don't get any possible clipping? You realize if your master is going 2 dB over 0 in true peak, and then you tell the limiter, no, I want you to stop it at -1 true peak, you're telling the mastering limiter to put 3 more decibels of gain reduction on your mix. And if you're already playing up in the competitively loud area, that's way too much extra squash, and still try to stay competitively loud. It's just going to, your mix is going to be flattened out like a pancake and truly lose all of its life. And this is why nobody actually does it, because even though theoretically, yes, theoretically, you shouldn't let your peaks go over -1 true peak, because theoretically that will be better when you transcode it to something like Opus 96 or whatever, right? Theoretically. But in practice, it would make your mix sound horrible at competitive loudness levels. And that's why nobody does it, because so many songs out there now are competitively loud for a variety of reasons I've already talked about in the early parts of this series, so I won't rehash it again. Now, let's move on to how you can definitively, for yourself, definitively prove that true peak and streaming target numbers do not matter. And you can do that with one tool, Streamliner by Adapter. You can get this on sale from Plugin Alliance for pretty cheap. I've seen it go for $29. It often goes for $49, right? Sometimes you can get really low with the discounts that Plugin Alliance puts out there. So my advice is go get this, because it's awesome. It's awesome for monitoring. It's awesome for double checking. So a couple things to know about this. First of all, anytime you pick a platform, right, I say ignore these for the most part and just set your own targets. You can set these target numbers by dragging them up and down. I usually target 7 LUFS for myself as kind of a, you know, if I'm overshooting 7, why? Most things don't need to be louder than -7 LUFS. For the PSR, again, you can choose what your target range is for your microdynamics, and I usually pick 8 PLR because that is competitively loud, but not super loud. Once you drop below 8, you're in the loud range. Once you drop below 6, you're in the crushed range or super loud range. I can't remember. We'll see when I start playing things here. Anyway, I usually go for like overall, I want my peak to loudness ratio, which is like crest factor, but expressed in LUFS terms. I like to shoot for 8. You can go out here and find a bunch of sample levels. Like if we go check, you know, in the dance music genres, you know, what does Daft Punk Get Lucky hit, right? Okay, so this is what Daft Punk's dynamic range hit, was 10 PLR, right? For this song, and their LUFS was down at 10. If we go back to dance again and we pick something more in the area that I like to work in, which is kind of like Noisia and their range of sounds, right? See, like me, they go for roughly -7 overall LUFS. 8 dynamic range. And in this case, they kept their true peak at just a little under 0. I usually bump it up to 0 and just don't even care about true peak. So let's see how this song measures. A little tip about using Streamliner, if you click this gear, when you're just measuring with the meters, you want to make sure low latency is on, because this adds a lot of latency to do its codec checking. I'll talk about that in a second, but let's just see what this one crescendo section measures. And I want you to watch the true peak. Okay, if you were watching this section, you notice how most of the time those orange bars were below my 0 ceiling, right? They were even below the -1 ceiling. Like if I were to set this to -1, you'd see that a lot of times they did stay below even -1. Okay. But yeah, certainly at the loudest, most busy sections, they were pushing above -1 and closer to 0. But most of the time, they were staying below 0. And they only occasionally actually flicked up to these higher values above 0. So true peaks don't happen all the time and even if they do, they're not necessarily problematic. But just be aware that when you see these large red true peak numbers somewhere, you go, oh, I got a big problem, but you might not. It might just be a couple little blips here and there in the song, right? So don't freak out too much about true peak. Anyway, so you can see, my target loudness is -7. I'm measuring in at more like -7.7. So about halfway between 7 and 8, which is where I wanted it. And you can see that my PLR, my actual measured PLR, was a little bit better than 8, right? It's a little bit below the line. Well, overall, it's a little bit above the line on average. And if you watch this PSR number, this is interesting too. Watch how this descriptor goes from crushed to loud to competitive to other labels like that. Let's look at a verse section, for example. Competitive, dynamic, competitive. Dynamic, right? We're staying very dynamic during the verse sections. And when we go to the solo section, watch it now. Competitive, dynamic, competitive. Got a little bit loud there at the end of that sweep. Right, so this PSR is a very useful indicator. It's kind of like short-term crest factor. You can think of it that way, with some descriptive elements. And I think the descriptive elements are pretty accurate. If we go to the solo section, the crescendo section, it's going to get a little into loud territory, but it's never going to hit crushed. This crushed happens at like -5 LUFS and beyond, super ridiculously loud. Loud, competitive, dynamic, competitive, loud. So, these indicators are really good indicators of your microdynamics. And they're very useful. So worth thinking about, worth having just for this metering alone, just to be a little more confident that you're not getting too crushed at any point. And actually, a lot of times your songs are going to sound fairly dynamic and then maybe loud or competitive in the loudest parts, and that's okay. That's normal for a song. Okay, so let's talk about how bad is this true peak going over 0? Well, that's what this codec checking is for. Now, my tip for this is make sure you turn off low latency when you're going to do this codec checking. And it is a significant latency bump. Let's go to the listen bus where this sits. My latency now on the listen bus is 340 milliseconds. It's a lot of latency, right? If I turn low latency mode back on, this drops to next to nothing, right? So it's a big amount of latency, but you need it because what you're going to be doing is clicking this codec button on and off. And the latency is so that this is gapless and you can instantly toggle the codec on and off. And the way you use this is, okay, let's set it to be Spotify Premium. You can see Spotify Premium uses a codec called Ogg Vorbis 320 kilobytes, right? Or kilobits, rather. And we can just toggle this on and off and hear it with and without the transcoding, right? So do you hear any difference? Let's find out. Do you hear any horrible distortion caused by this true peak clipping? Oh my gosh, right? It's just not there. Well, okay, granted, this is Spotify Premium. It's 320-bit lossless encoding. You wouldn't expect to hear much difference. But let's go to their crappiest mobile codec, which is Ogg Vorbis 96K bits, right? Now let's see what this sounds like on and off. Does it sound terrible when we listen to it through Spotify's worst quality codec? Right? Now you can see when you flip the codec on the terrible quality codec, you can see that suddenly, that transcoding does create really high true peaks. We're going all the way up to about 2.2 over 0 in true peak. But do you hear the clipping? Do you hear it? Does it sound like this mix has been destroyed because of these 2 decibel true peak values? No, it hasn't, right? Let's test it again on a different codec. Let's go to SoundCloud, one of the worst codecs out there. Let's go to free, Opus 96. Oh my gosh, I hate Opus so much. Let's see what this sounds like with it off and with it on. Right? You can hear the difference. You can hear that the codec doesn't sound quite as good. The top end loses a little bit of its definition and gets ever so slightly more grainy or clouded sounding, but it's not massive peak distortion or clipping. You're not hearing this clipping from this true peak that everyone's so afraid of. You just don't hear it. Let's go to the vocal section of the song and just let you hear nice, clean vocals with this.
I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen.
Does that sound like the mix is getting destroyed to you? No. No. It's just not. It's almost no difference at all, right? So if you're really worried that Baffy's telling you to ignore true peak, go get this. Test your own mixes for yourself. See for yourself. right? This is the absolute definitive objective truth of the matter. And I guarantee you all the pros have been using tools like this for a while. That's why they know they can ignore true peak. Because by contrast, if I were to turn on a limiter and say, you know, limit everything down to -1, suddenly my mix will sound much more squashed. And that's objectively worse than the small differences you're hearing by going with even the crappiest possible codecs over here. Okay, so get yourself Streamliner, put an end to the myth when people, you know, when someone tells you, hey, why aren't you, you know, setting your true peak to -1 in your mastering limiter? This will put your mind at ease. Okay, so what else should we talk about? Dithering and bit depth. Yeah, that's the last thing. So here's the thing. Almost every mastering limiter, like Pro L2, has settings for dither, right? And they'll have all these different noise shape settings, and Ozone has these crazy sounding ones like mbit 4 and stuff like that. My advice is don't really bother with the dithering from your mastering limiter. Turn it off if you can. If you can't turn it off, choose the simplest dithering, which is called triangular in most cases. Although, again, you can see here they just have off, noise shaped, and optimized. So Pro L2 doesn't even really, maybe basic, maybe none. Yeah, noise shaping none. That's what it is. If we were to turn this on and say I'm going to export a 16-bit master or a 24-bit master with none for noise shaping, this is triangular dithering. TDPF is the abbreviation. So if you really feel like you need to do the dithering with the mastering limiter itself, my advice is go with triangular dither, and it's going to be named differently in every one of these limiters. Ozone has really weird names for its dithering algorithms. But ultimately, I say turn it off and don't even let your mastering limiter do the dithering. Instead, when you do your export audio or whatever your DAW's version of whatever might be, just choose dithering at that time and let your DAW do it. Because almost every DAW is going to use the simplest possible dithering, which is called triangular, or TDPF. And long story short, noise shape dithering plays games by stacking most of the noise up in the high region of the spectrum, with the theory being that psychoacoustically you won't notice it as much. Again, this is one of those things where theory versus practical outcome is, sometimes you do hear that dithering that's noise shaped, especially in fades and things like that. And it can also contribute to overall buildup and harshness in your upper frequencies, just a tiny bit, just the tiniest bit. It's very subtle. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world if you want to go with some noise-shaped dithering of some sort, but I honestly feel like you can't hear the dithering noise anyway. It's down at the noise floor. And you just want the simplest symmetrical triangular dithering, which is kind of like an even wash of pink noise across the very bottom of your mix at the noise floor. Because if you're ever going to repurpose a master, like if you're ever going to allow someone to take your master and resample bits of it for use in their own projects, you know, famous way we used to work when we would just routinely borrow from each other's stuff and take little samples out of famous songs and use them in our own music. You want that triangular dithering because it's going to be the most neutral sounding when you resample and reuse something that's been dithered one time. If you use something with noise shape dithering, it's going to have a lot of extra stuff cranked in the high frequencies that might affect you, especially if you're using processing that amplifies and pumps up what's going on closer to the noise floor in the high frequency section, which if you do dance and electronic music is a lot of processes. I mean, OTT is going to raise a lot of that stuff down near the noise floor closer to perception. So use triangular dithering. Keep it simple. They really don't make that much difference in the long run. It's one of these splitting hairs things. It's how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Keep it simple. Triangular dithering is the least, it's the most neutral of the dithering types, especially if something's ever going to be reused in another production. So that's my advice about dithering. And then when it comes to the bit depth, when you export audio, you always have a choice of, okay, well, what bit depth? Should it be 16-bit? Should it be 24-bit? Should it be 32-bit floating point, right? Theoretically and practically, you're not going to hear any audible, human audible difference between 16-bit and 24-bit because 16-bit is a wide enough dynamic range that any kind of noise down near the noise floor is so far below audible perception, you don't hear it. 24-bit is overkill in terms of human hearing. Where 24-bit isn't overkill kind of has to do with transcoding and, processes that convert your lossless wave or AIFF file into a transcoded MP3 or Opus or whatever. That's where you want that noise floor as far away as possible from the top end at 0 dBFS. And that's what 24 bits does. It basically pushes the floor much further down. And it makes any kind of dithering noise or truncation distortion or intermodulation distortion or any kind of bad things that lurk down near the noise floor. They're further away from where the RMS of the signal is, so it's much harder for them to get pulled up in closer to perceptible range when the file goes through weird processing like transcoding to a lossy codec. So this is why I recommend when you export, if you were just burning a CD like in the old days, 16-bit was perfect, right? Didn't need to go any further than 16-bit. But in these days of uploading to a distributor like DistroKid, and then they run it through a bunch of different conversion processors to upload to each of the streaming platforms out there, and it gets transcoded into all these different codecs, you want that noise floor as far away as possible. 24-bit, upload 24-bit masters, okay? Don't upload 16-bit masters. So for that, from that standpoint, you should always just pick a 24-bit master. It's just objectively better in the long run. However, there is a little bit of a gotcha here for DJs, especially if you use Rekordbox, which is what most of the clubs in North America anyway tend to use. I think over in Europe, Denon is starting to challenge Pioneer a little bit, and Denon is becoming, Denon Prime decks and gear are becoming a little more standard over there. But certainly if you're in North America, Rekordbox is it. Pioneer setups are it. And there are some old Pioneer CDJs that have problems with 24-bit masters. Sometimes you'll put them on a USB. You'll take your USB to a show, you'll plug it into the CDJ, and the damn 24-bit won't show up. It's usually just on the older CDJs. You never know if you're going to run into it. So just common tribal knowledge among DJs is, yeah, burn a 24-bit version of a master to upload to the streaming platforms, but also burn a 16-bit version and have a backup, USB that's just got 16-bit songs on it, just in case you discover at the last minute in a club that, your 24-bit USB isn't working right. Just a little bit of tribal knowledge for you there. Hopefully that'll become less of a problem in the future. Technically, Pioneer supports 24-bit. Practically, they don't. It's just known. It's a known quantity. So if you're a DJ, you might want the 16-bit sometimes. But upload for platforms and for publishing, do 24-bit. And that's pretty much all I have to say about the mastering end of things. Hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.